Good morning, everybody. Mr. R here. Time for another story time. And some of you are probably wondering why I'm wearing a jacket today. Well, the jacket is actually going to be in our story. And there's also something else in the story that I have in one of my jacket pockets, which you can't see, which I'll show you later. Now, our story today is about a man called Simon Percy. And Simon Percy had a hat shop in London town. Hats were very, very popular in England and in London at that time. And everybody had hats. And you would have a hat for a different reason. So you might have a rain hat and you might have a sun hat. But you'd also might, for instance, if you were a child, have a hat for going to school. You would have different hats for sports. You would have a smart hat for going out somewhere, and adults too had hats for work and for going out, and for the sunshine and for the rain, so for different weather conditions. So hats were really popular in London, and there were lots of hat shops, and Simon Percy had one of these hat shops, and he took a lot of pride in his hat shop. That means he really looked after it. Simon lived about 10 minutes away from his shop, so every morning he would walk to his shop in the morning, unlock the door and get ready for work. If you walked past Simon's hat shop, he would have a beautiful display of different types of hats for ladies and for gentlemen and for children, all displayed in his window. And then inside his shop, behind the counter where he worked, he would have rows of hats on shelves that you could try on and decide which one you would like. Simon worked from Monday to Friday, so Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and he would start work at 9 o'clock in the morning and normally finish at around about 5 or 6 o'clock. And then he would take the short walk home to his wife, and then in the morning he would repeat the process. So from Monday to Friday, the hat shop was always open. It wasn't open at the weekends. But Simon had a secret that nobody knew about apart from himself. Because every Wednesday, after his day had finished and he'd locked up the shop, he would always tell his wife the same thing, that he was going to be working late. He would tell his wife that he had to see how many hats he sold, and he would have to order new hats, and he would have to clean the shop and make things ready for the following week, and he would have to do a bunch of other jobs in his shop. So he would always be working late on a Wednesday. But actually, that's not what Simon was doing, and that's kind of what this story is about. Because on a Wednesday at 4 o'clock, when Simon locked the shop, he would pull down the blinds and go to the back of his shop. At the back of his shop, like I told you before, there are rows of hats on shelves. And in the middle of the shelves was a small button. When Simon pressed this button, the two sides of the shelves would open up, revealing a door. So you can imagine that these shelves, there are 4 or 5 shelves running down the wall, and in the middle of the shelves, you wouldn't see it if you didn't know where to look, was a very, very small grey button which Simon pressed, and then the two, almost like the wall, would open up, and behind it was a door. Simon would open the door and walk down the steps, and the steps led right underneath his shop, and at the bottom of the steps was another door. And Simon would open up the door into a room. There were only 3 things in this room. There was a big cupboard in one corner, there was a desk, and there was a chair. That's all there was. And Simon would walk into this room, he would close the door, and the first thing he always did was go to the cupboard, and he would open up the cupboard. Now, on the top shelf, he had packs of playing cards. And on the second shelf, he had a stack of money. like lots of money, hundreds and hundreds of pounds, filling up the whole shelf. And on the third shelf, he had jackets and a change of clothes. And what Simon would do, first of all, he would change out of his work clothes and put on his smart jacket and his smart pants and his smart shirt and boots. And then he would take out a pack of his playing cards. And he would sit down on the chair in front of his desk. And he would start playing with the cards. Now, when I say playing with the cards, of course he had nobody to play with. What he was really doing was he was shuffling the cards. He was moving the cards around in his hands. Now, unfortunately, I'm not very good with cards, so I can't show you how he would do that. And even if I was good with cards, I could never do what Simon could do, because Simon could move his hands really quickly. And he could shuffle the cards in lots of different ways. So he could shuffle the cards up, and he could shuffle the cards across. He could shuffle the cards with his eyes shut. He could pick out cards very quickly. He had very, very quick hands. And he would practice with the cards for quite some time. It didn't say in the story how long he would practice for, but I'm thinking at least half an hour Simon will be playing with the cards. Now, once his fingers were nice and flexible and he played with the cards long enough, it was then that his jacket became important. Because in those days, a very, very popular game in casinos where you would play cards and gamble was a game called tens. Now, the cards were a little bit different in those days. We're talking about 200 or 300 years ago. Because in a pack of cards, you had 10 tens. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So you would have 10 tens in a pack of cards. The rest of the cards were just normal cards. There are 52 cards in a packet of cards, but 10 of the cards would be tens. And the game that Simon would play in the casinos was called tens. And it was quite a simple game. Each person playing had 6 cards. So you had 6 cards. And you would gamble, that means you would bet with money how many tens you had. So the more tens you had, the more money you would bet. So if you had 6 cards and you had 1 10, that would be quite good because there are only 10 tens in a pack. If you had 2 tens, that would be pretty good. If you had 3 tens, that would be fantastic, because don't forget the other people in the game might have tens too. If you had 4 or 5 tens, that was almost impossible, because remember, other people have got the tens too. So if you had 6 cards and 5 of them were tens, there was no way you were going to lose. Now, this is where the jacket comes in. And again, I can't show you this because I'm not Simon and I don't have his quick hands. But Simon had pockets built inside his sleeves. So in the story, it said that Simon had 5 pockets, and each pocket was big enough to hold a card. And then on the other side of his jacket, on the other sleeve, he also had 5 pockets that could hold a card. And attached to each little pocket was a tiny, tiny little piece of string, probably a little bit more like the fishing wire that I told you about in the last story that I was talking to you about. Do you remember when I was talking to you about the little orphan boy who got tricked when he stole the wallet? Well, this would have been similar, a very, very small piece of fishing wire that came out of his sleeve but was attached to all of the pockets. And this little piece of fishing wire would go under Simon's watch so it held in place, and then it would go up into the palm of his hand. And then he had another wire going down into this palm of his hand too. So I'm not sure about this. I would imagine he had something else on this wrist to keep the piece of wire underneath. And this was what he would do. He would be playing a game of cards, and what he would do was he would be looking at his 6 cards, and let's say he only had 1 10. Well, what he would do was he would hide one of his cards in this sleeve, because this side was empty, it had no cards, and then he would replace it with a 10 from this sleeve. So if, for instance, he had his 6 cards, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, what he would do was he would slip one of these cards into this sleeve, and then out of this sleeve he would pull a 10 to replace it. So now he had 2 10s, and of course he could do that again. So he could slip another card into this sleeve and he could replace it with one of his 10s. Now, this was what Simon did at the table. He would practice hiding and slipping a 10, hiding and slipping a 10. And he was so good at this that you couldn't see his hands moving. So if he had his 6 cards, he could move his hand so quickly just by flicking his wrist that one card would disappear and another card would appear. And he would practice for a long time until he was, like I said, you wouldn't even know what he was doing with his hands. And once he was happy, he would put the cards back in the cupboard and he would walk back up the steps, lock his shop, and he would go into the centre of London. And in the centre of London, there were lots of casinos. Casinos are where you gamble for money. And he would walk into one of these casinos that he hasn't visited, and he would sit down at a tens table. Tens table is where you play tens. And he would ask the people at the table whether he could join in with the game. And once they were playing, Simon would start losing. So he would have his 6 cards and he hardly ever had a 10. And people he was playing with would start thinking to themselves, we don't have to worry about this guy, he's not very good. Look at all the money he's losing. Every hand he's lost. And of course, when somebody loses, you start betting more money. So because Simon wasn't very good at this game, or so the people thought, they would start betting more money on their cards. They thought, we don't have to worry about this guy, he hasn't won anything. But Simon was very clever, because after 2 or 3 hands of cards, when the pile of money grew big in the table, Simon would start pulling out 10s. And it wasn't long before he was winning every single hand. A hand is 1 round of game of cards. And he would win for maybe 2 or 3 times until he had a huge pile of money in front of him. And then he would say good evening to all of the people at the card table. He would put the money in his pockets, in his jacket pockets, and he would leave the casino. And then he would go to another casino. He always went to 2 casinos in one night. And he would do the same thing. He would start off by losing for maybe 5 or 10 minutes until the pile of money grew big in the table. And then he would start replacing the cards with the 10s that he had in his jacket pocket. Now, Simon was doing this one time. I mean, he'd been doing this for a long time, which is why he had so much money in his shop. When he was spotted by a policeman, policemen would walk around casinos and look at the tables to make sure that no one was cheating. And there was a very clever policeman who saw Simon come into the shop. And he saw how Simon looked just a little bit nervous. He kept on looking around at the people, looking to see which table he was going to join. And the policeman thought to himself, I'll just watch this guy. So when Simon sat down and he started losing, the policeman thought, well, I've got nothing to worry about. It doesn't look like he's very good at cards. But then he watched how suddenly Simon started winning all of the games. And the policeman decided to follow him. So when Simon left his shop and he went to the second casino, the policeman also went to the second casino. And he saw exactly the same thing happening. How Simon started losing all of his games before he started winning all of his games. And the policeman couldn't see how he was cheating. Normally, if somebody's cheating, you can spot it straight away because, for instance, somebody's got a card hidden under their foot and they bend down and pick it up, or somebody's got a card hidden in a jacket pocket. But the policeman could not spot how Simon was cheating, but he became suspicious when he started winning all of this money. So he started following Simon back to the shop. But Simon had been doing this for a long time, and he had a feeling something was wrong. He didn't know anybody was following him, but he just had a bad feeling. So what he did was, when he went around a corner of a street, he hid in a shop corner. And the policeman who was following Simon walked straight past him, wondering where he had gone. And as soon as the policeman disappeared around the next corner, Simon came out of his hiding place, and now he knew that he'd been followed and he needed to be really careful. So when Simon went back to his shop and he unlocked his shop and he went down into his secret room and he put his jacket back in a cupboard and the huge pile of money that he'd won that evening, he sat down at his table for a while and he decided that he wasn't going to play cards for a while until things had quietened down again and this policeman hopefully had moved on and had forgotten all about him. So for the next 2 or 3 weeks, Simon didn't go out and he didn't play cards, but it wasn't long before he got restless again and he decided to go out and play. Now, it so happened that the first casino that Simon went to play, there was the same policeman. Now, Simon hadn't seen his face, so he didn't know that this was the same policeman that had followed him home. So he did his usual trick. He started losing. He would lose for 5 or 10 minutes until people started betting more and more money. And when the pile of money was big in the middle of the table, Simon would start hiding his cards and replacing them with his tens. And then he moved on to his second casino. And this time the policeman knew that he had to be cheating. And he followed him to his second casino. And again he watched as Simon started winning all of the money. And this time the policeman watched his hands very quickly and he didn't see anything really unusual apart from the fact that Simon kept on flicking his wrist. His hands were so quick and he was replacing the cards so quickly. He didn't see old cards disappearing and new cards appearing, but he did see that flick of the wrist and he followed Simon back to the shop. Now Simon this time didn't realise that anybody was following. Actually, he was feeling pretty proud of himself because he'd won a lot of money that evening. So I think he was just walking along the street, probably whistling, feeling pretty happy with himself. And when he got back to his shop, he unlocked his shop, he locked it again, and then he opened up his secret door and went down and started putting the money on his second shelf and changing. And then he went back home to his wife. In the meantime, the policeman was outside the shop. And policemen in those days could open most doors with small tools that they had in their pocket. And the policeman was able to get inside the hat shop. The blinds were down, so he didn't have to worry about turning the lights on. And he looked around the hat shop and he was very surprised. He thought to himself, well, this man owns a hat shop. Maybe he's not stealing anything. Maybe he's just really good at cards. but he was still really suspicious. So he looked around the shop. He looked in the shop window, all the hats. He even looked underneath all of the hats. And then he went behind the counter where Simon worked. And he looked at the counter and he looked at the drawers of hats, but he didn't find anything. And then he turned around and looked at the hats on the shelves. And he looked and everything seemed normal, apart from where the shelves met in the middle. The gap seemed to run all the way to the top of the ceiling and all the way down. And the policeman was suspicious. And he looked at this gap and he rattled it a bit, and he saw that sure enough the gap became a little bit wider. And he started looking for a way that these two sides of the shelves in the wall opened up. And it wasn't long before he found the small grey button that was hidden really well. And when of course he pressed it, the door clicked open. And there behind, when he opened it up, was a second door. The policeman went down the steps, and the next part of this was easy. He unlocked the door at the bottom with his tools, and he went into the room, and he went straight to the cupboard and opened it up. There was no lock on the cupboard. And he saw the rows and rows of playing cards on the top shelf. And then his eyes grew big when he saw thousands and thousands of pounds on the second shelf and the smart jackets. And now the policeman knew that this guy must have been cheating at cards. So he spent the rest of that evening and the night going back to the police station and making sure that enough policemen were waiting in the shop in the morning when he knew that the man, Simon, would arrive to open up. So when Simon opened up his shop in the morning at 9 o'clock, ready to start his day's work, there were 6 or 7 policemen waiting for him. And Simon was arrested. He was taken to the police station and he was kept in the police station until it was decided when he had to go and see the judge. So he was in the police station for 1 or 2 days, very similar to the other story that I told you about, where the orphan was sentenced by the judge when he stole. And he was taken before the judge, and the judge heard the policeman's story, and then he was shown and told about the cupboard with all of the hidden money and the packs of playing cards. And the judge didn't take very long to decide that Simon was guilty of cheating at cards. Simon was sentenced to 10 years in prison, which was a long time. And there was nothing he could do. He was told that he was going to be kept in the police station for another day or two, and then he was going to be taken to the prison on the other side of town, on the other side of the forest. So for 2 days, Simon sat in the police station waiting to be taken. And on the second day, he was brought up, handcuffed, and he was put inside a police wagon. And inside the police wagon was a policeman sitting down opposite him on a bench. And the police wagon very slowly started moving through the city of London, getting closer to the forest. The journey was about an hour, and once they got into the forest, Simon started talking to the policeman opposite him. But the policeman very quickly said to him, "Listen, we know all about you. I've been told not to talk to you because you're a very tricky person." And Simon laughed and said, "I'm not tricky, I don't know what you're talking about." But the policeman said, "We know all about you and how you cheated at cards." And Simon said, I'm guilty. I might be guilty, but I mean, it wasn't as if I was cheating everybody. It was I was just good at cards. But the policeman didn't believe him and refused to talk to him. But as the journey went on, Simon pulled out a packet of cards from his pocket. and he asked the policeman whether he would mind if he shuffled them. And so Simon started shuffling the cards in front of the policeman. But instead of the way that he shuffled the cards when he was alone, Simon started dropping the cards and making mistakes. And it wasn't long before the cards were all over the floor. So Simon picked them up and he started shuffling them again, and the same thing happened. They kind of, he dropped them and he fumbled them and they moved around, and he would pick them up again. And the police officer who was sitting opposite him started laughing and said to him, "For somebody who cheated at cards, you're actually not very good with them. You're really slow and your fingers are like you're really clumsy with the cards." And Simon said, "Why don't you show me?" So the police officer took the cards and he started shuffling them. And Simon said, "Hey, you're pretty good. You want a game?" And the police officer looked at Simon, wondering whether this was a trick. And he said, "Well, we got another half an hour or so. I guess a game wouldn't hurt. What do you want to play? How about tens?" said Simon. "Sure," said the police officer. So they started playing tens. And Simon lost every single game. And the police officer got more and more confident. And Simon said, "How about we have a little bet?" And the police officer said, "What have you got in mind?" And Simon said, "Well, I'll let you into a little secret. They found most of my money in my cupboard in my shop, but I have a box full of money hidden in the forest, actually in this forest, not very far from here. Here's what I'm suggesting. Let's have a game of tens. Just one game. If you win, I will tell you where the box of tens is. But if I win, you set me free." And the police officer looked at Simon and said, "What do you mean you have a box of money in the forest?" And Simon said, I can tell you exactly where the tree is, because it's the biggest tree in the forest. I've hidden several £1,000s in a box underneath the tree. If you win the game, I'll tell you where the box is, and you'll be rich. You'll never have to work again. But if I win, you have to open up the door and you have to let me jump out and I'll disappear." And the police officer thought about it. The police officer actually had lots of money problems. He had a large family and he really needed the money, and he'd won every single game that they'd played. So he took a chance and he said, "Okay, we'll do it." Now, what the police officer didn't know was that Simon had on one of his jackets. And they hadn't taken his jacket when they'd arrested him. He'd had lots of these jackets fitted with the pockets, and they'd actually left the jacket on him. So he had the tens already hidden in his sleeve. So when they started playing the game and they got dealt their 6 cards, when Simon looked at his cards, he didn't have any tens at all. But within a flick of his wrist, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, he had 5 tens, and he put one of the cards away. Now, there was no way you could beat 5 tens, so it didn't matter what the policeman had. Simon knew that he'd won the round. And when the police officer laid his cards in front, he had only 1 10, but of course Simon had his 5, and the police officer couldn't believe it. But he was an honest person, and he let Simon go. When they went up a very particularly slow hill, he opened up the back door, and Simon jumped down from the back of the police wagon, and he disappeared into the forest. I don't know what happened to that police officer when they arrived at the prison, and Simon was no longer in the police wagon, but Simon disappeared. And there the story gets a little bit confusing, because nobody really knows what happened to Simon. I'm thinking that he went to the tree in the forest and he dug up the box and he disappeared with all of the money. And there were stories that he left the country, and there were stories of an extremely talented card player playing cards in different parts of the world. So I think that he moved around a lot and lived in a lot of different countries playing cards and probably earning a lot of money and probably very, very rich. So that's really the end of the story. Kind of a bit of a mysterious story this week about Simon the card player. I hope you enjoyed it. Everybody, I hope you keep safe, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again next week. Bye.